Good morning. My name is Bob Surridge. I'm a member of the board of the Southport Historical Society, and with my partner Musette,
yes, I've got
we worked to put this Tuesday Talk program together. My partner's leaving. I was thinking, it's amazing I'm here today, because the Gospel Fest in the Black History Symposium on Sunday, there was a Gospel Fest. It was absolutely fantastic. The community building was moving. It was great. So if you didn't make it this year, put it down. We have the Black History Symposium. It starts Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, and all the programs are good. But put a special mark on the Sunday program. It was really great. Today's Tuesday Talk is about Harry Hayden and the Wilmington Rebellion, the only coup d'etat. I wish my set was here. The only coup d'etat in United States history. Our speaker, our talker, is Liz Fuller. Liz and her husband Bob have come to us, I guess, lately from Connecticut. Right? And Liz is a brand new member of the board of directors of the Southport Historical Society, and she's also taken on the role as the editor of the Society's newsletter, which is called the Whittler's Bench. In her background, which is great and fantastic, right, Bob? Yeah, good. That's my message. Liz was a executive with American Express, and when she retired, and having worked with nonprofits and for nonprofits my entire life, I love this part of the story. When she retired, she went and she got a PhD in community development so that she could work with nonprofit organizations. Wow. I think that alone. Liz, you got your first applause.
There we go. All right, thank you for coming. All right. Okay, good morning.
Good morning.
As Bob mentioned, we're going to be talking about Harry Hayden and the Wilmington Rebellion of 1898. And I do want to sort of give a mention up front. As I was putting this presentation together, I was reflecting on the fact that it's a bit different topic than what we usually do on Tuesday Talks. And by that, I mean it's a bit more of an uncomfortable conversation that we're going to be having today than we sometimes do. But at the same time, I feel it's a really worthwhile conversation to have, and that it's important to have. So I'll be checking back in with you at the end of the presentation, but I hope that you also feel it's been a worthwhile use of your time, even if a little bit of it is uncomfortable. So, as I was putting it together, I came across this quote by Jill Lepore, who's a historian, and she was talking about the role of historians and what that role is. And she said, you know, it's not our job to criticize the past or to judge the past or to be moralists. It's really our job to look for the truth and to understand it and then to convey that truth. So that's sort of the mindset I'd like to use today as we go through it. I'm not here to judge or condemn or look down upon anything that's happened in the past, but more to really try to understand it and communicate it and help us all gain some understanding. So the reason that this topic even came up is that Bob, who runs the Susie Carson Research Room for the Historical Society, got a donation of this manuscript. This is the second volume. There's 3 volumes of this. And this is an unpublished manuscript written by Harry Hayden, which is a history of Southport and his experiences in Southport and some of Southport's history. So Bob asked me to do a little digging and find out a little bit more about Harry Hayden. He knew that he was a journalist from Wilmington, but he wasn't really clear on what his connection was to Southport and what had prompted him to write a story about it. And so I did. I found out that Harry Hayden was born in Wilmington in 1890. His family was pretty comfortable. His father was an ex-Confederate soldier, and he had developed a business in Wilmington for wagons and carriages, and it was a premier business there. They were doing pretty well. Unfortunately for Harry, his father passed away when he was 13 years old. But his mother, she had been educated. She'd been a teacher before she got married, a history teacher in a private academy. She had some good business sense, so she actually took over the business, and it continued to prosper, and she sent Harry to private school. It's from his mother that Harry learned his love of history, and especially of Southport. She used to take him on steamboat rides down the Cape Fear River, and she would tell him stories about the history of the Cape Fear region. And she would lament the fact that she didn't think people knew their history enough and that it was important. When World War I broke out, Harry joined the military, and he served in France. And when he was in training and when he was overseas, he would write long letters back home to his mother and to friends, and those letters would end up getting published in the Wilmington newspaper. So when he got out of the military, he became a journalist, and he spent his career as a journalist and as an editor of various newspapers throughout the South. Now, his connection to Southport, this up here is the steamship that he used to go down on. That's the Wilmington steamship. And the gentleman in the center there is Captain John T. Harper, and he was the captain of the steamship. And he actually was from Southport, and he was a very popular man. Everyone liked him. His passengers liked him. Everybody in Wilmington and in Southport, he was very well liked. And he had a brother, Captain James Harper, who was also steamship captain, and his wife, Sophie Drew Harper. And they were both from families that had long pasts in Southport. I do want to say this Harper family is a different Harper family than the newspaper Harper family. Both very well liked Harper families, but just not related. And then they had 6 children between them that they raised in Southport. And Harry was particularly close to 3 of the children. In the middle, you see their oldest daughter, Mary Rebecca Harper Hayden. She ended up marrying Harry, and Harry was her second husband. She was widowed, and she married him when she was about 48, and Harry was younger. He was about 38. And she had an older brother, Jesse Price, who spent his life in Southport. He was captain here, and he was older than his sister, so he was about 20 years older than Harry. And then her brother-in-law, William Augustus French, he was married to one of her sisters. So they were all friends of Harry's. So it was a nice little bit of research, nice little connection to Southport, and I was just about done with my research and gave it back to Bob. And I came across this booklet that Harry had written and published in 1936. And it said, "The Story of the Wilmington Rebellion." Now, as Bob mentioned, I only moved to North Carolina within the last couple of years, and so I'd never heard of the Wilmington Rebellion, didn't know anything about it. On the cover it says, "It's the first authentic account of the Wilmington Revolution of 1898, which resulted in the elimination of the Negro as a political factor in Wilmington and North Carolina, and which led to the disenfranchisement of the race throughout the South through the instrumentality of the Grandfather Clause." Wow. So I read the booklet. It's about 36 pages long. So I read it, and then I read it again, and then I read it a third time because I was really confused. I didn't understand who the players were. I didn't understand what the motives were. And I was also particularly confused because it seemed to me that Harry was describing a coup d'etat. That was not a word I ever associated with the United States. I had no clue that we'd ever have a political coup, nor would we have any reason to, because we have a system, we have democracy. If you don't like the government, you wait a few years and you vote them out, or you impeach them, but you don't have to overthrow them with violence. So I started trying to make sense of this and realized that Harry was actually talking about a plan that had 4 steps. And he said it was planned by a committee of people in Wilmington, and it was planned and then it was executed, and it followed the plan. So the first step was to steal the election. Now, he wasn't just talking about an election in Wilmington. He was saying across the state, they stole the election. And then after that, they led a riot. And the way that they would start the riot, the plan, and what they did, was to destroy the printing press of the only black newspaper in Wilmington. That would lead to a riot. And then, when that violence was going on, then they would stage a coup, and they would get rid of the leadership in Wilmington. They would get rid of the mayor and the alderman and the sheriff and the deputies. And afterwards, they would banish anybody that they thought would rise up against them, anybody that was against the new regime. And so that was the version that Harry told. Now remember, he said it was the first authentic version, and he wrote this about 40 years after it happened. So obviously there was another version that was being told before Harry's version, and that was the official version. And that version has been the official version for well over 100 years. And that version was written by a man named Alfred Moore Waddell. And he didn't call it the rebellion, he called it the race riot of 1898. Now he didn't come up with that term, but he did popularize it. And he described what happened differently. He said, first of all, we won the election, we didn't steal the election. Then we had to put down a riot. He did agree with Harry that the riot ensued because they had destroyed the printing press of the newspaper. A fire did ensue, but that wasn't intentional. The fire happened while they were destroying the newspaper, but he doesn't know how. Afterwards, after this riot occurred, the leadership, the mayor, the sheriff, the alderman, realized they had lost the confidence of the community, and they turned in their resignations. And that he and other members of his colleagues accepted those resignations and took positions in place, and that's when he became mayor. And then afterwards, people left. There were a lot of people that didn't want to live in Wilmington anymore. It was about 2,000 or 3,000 people that left, mostly African Americans, but that was their own choice. So that's the official version that has been in place for about 100 years. So who should we believe? As historians, a lot of times we find conflicting views of events that happen. And it's hard to know which is the real one. And we try to validate it, we try to look at how we can corroborate the story with other ways. And another thing to look at is considering the source of the information. Who is it that's telling us this? How did they find out this information? And what's their agenda in telling it to us? So when we compare Harry to the mayor, we see that Harry had spent his life as a journalist. He spent his life doing interviews, digging up facts, and writing stories in ways people can understand them. Mayor Waddell was a career politician and a public speaker. So he spent his life explaining facts in a way that furthered his agenda. Harry did live in Wilmington at the time of the events, but he was an 8-year-old child, so he has no first-hand knowledge of what happened. All of his information is coming from other people. The mayor, on the other hand, was involved in the events, so it's possible that he's giving us insider information and first-hand accounts. Now, Harry did not write his book as an investigative expose where he wanted the truth to come out and people to be punished for this actions. He wrote it because he wanted the truth to come out because he admired what they had done. He thought it was well planned, well executed, and that people should know, and that enough time had passed that it was okay to tell what really happened, and that other cities, other people might want to use it as a model. So he admired what had happened. The mayor was writing his within a few days, a few weeks of the events happening. And so he had some concerns about how it was going to be perceived, and that perhaps there might be some legal or some career consequences to the people that were involved. So he wanted to make sure that it appeared very justified in what they were doing. Now, the one thing that Harry and the mayor had in common was they were both unapologetic white supremacists. Whether it was planned and executed or whether it was a spontaneous action, they both felt that it was necessary and justified what had happened. So what was happening in Wilmington that made them think that this kind of action needed to be taken? So Wilmington in the 1890s, you might be surprised to know, was the largest and most important city in North Carolina. It was our way of doing commerce with the rest of the world because of the port. We shipped tons of cotton around the world. It was a very modern city. There were street lights, there were electric trolleys, there were telephones, there were telegraphs, there was a water system. There were about 20,000 people that lived there, and surprisingly, more than half of them were African American. Now, the majority of those people worked as laborers. They were laborers, they were cooks, they were laundresses, but about 20% of the businesses in Wilmington were owned by African Americans. They owned the majority of the eating houses, the majority of the barber shops. They owned one of the 4 dealers and shippers of fish and oysters. There were 2 buildings and loans that helped people build houses. They were the most sought after craftsmen. They were the plasterers, the brick masons, the carpenters, the stonemasons. If you think about it, before the war, all the buildings in Wilmington were built by enslaved people. When you think of Bellamy Mansion, Thalian Hall, when you look at those buildings, that's who built those buildings. So they had skills, and when the war ended, they still had those skills, and they were then able to, use those skills and be paid for them, and then they taught them to their children. There was also an educated class that was developing, so there were a few lawyers, some architects, some teachers, principals, the collector of the customs of the port, which was a very prestigious federally appointed job. There were school board members, deputy sheriffs, policemen, 2 entire fire departments, legislator, register of deeds, health officers, coroners, postal workers, mail carriers, and in 1897, 1/3 of the aldermen in Wilmington were African American. So three of the aldermen were African American. Over 1,000 African Americans owned some sort of property. And there was the Daily Record, which was the newspaper. It was the only daily black newspaper in the United States. And the black male literacy rate was higher than for white males.
Wow.
So there was a lot of progress in Wilmington, depending on your viewpoint. There were also a lot of people that thought things were not going well in Wilmington. So who were the players? Now this is a little confusing because we still use some of these same terms, but what they stand for has shifted somewhat. So the Democrats, when you think of the Democrats, think conservative, okay? These were the old guard. Many of them were former Confederate soldiers. It was 30 years later. They were older men. They were generally well off. They were resistant to change. They liked the old ways of being. So Democrats, conservative. Then you had the Republicans. That was a pretty new party. It was the party of Abraham Lincoln. He was the first Republican president. People that belonged to this were, they either were sympathizers with the North, they had moved from the North, and all of the freed slaves. When they registered to vote, they registered Republican. When they voted Republican. They were very, very loyal to the Republican Party. Then there was a new party that had moved in, and that was the Populist Party. And that was a progressive party, and it appealed to farmers and to rural whites. So if you were on the lower end of the socioeconomic scale and you were white, you joined the Populists. If you had some money and you joined, and you were in businesses, you joined the Democrats, okay? Now the Democrats outnumbered the Republicans Party and the Populist Party. But in the early 1890s, they started to think, well, if we joined together and voted together, the Republicans and the Populists, we might just outnumber the Democrats. And so this new fusionist party that fused the Republicans and the Populists, so they didn't go away, the parties were still there, but they decided to try to put up a common slate that they could vote for. So they formed this alliance, and it was an uneasy alliance, but it was an alliance. And it's important because it's the first time there was an interracial coalition where in parties, where they were political parties, where they were working together. So if we look at the timeline, we see that the Civil War ended in 1865, and then very quickly after that, we passed 3 amendments to the Constitution. We had the 13th, the 14th, and the 15th Amendment. The 13th Amendment ended slavery, except for convicts. The 14th Amendment gave citizenship to everyone born in the United States. And the 15th Amendment gave the right to vote to any male, regardless of color. And there was a requirement that any state that wanted to go back and join the Union would accept those amendments. So that ended in 1870. Then in 1877, Reconstruction ended very abruptly. The North pulled out, and between 1877 and 1894, the Democrats started taking back over the state. Then, in 1894, that was the first time that the Fusionists tried running a slate of candidates, and it worked. The Fusionists won all of the North Carolina elections, including sending a senator to the Senate. 2 years later, there was another election, and for the first time, there was a Republican governor in North Carolina. And then the following year, there was a Wilmington election, and the upshot of that is that there was a Fusionist mayor, the majority of the aldermen were Republican, and 3 of the aldermen were African American. So if you're a Democrat and you're looking at this, you have a state election, a federal election, and a local election that they lost all in a row. And that was very, very threatening to a lot of people in North Carolina. So before one other thing I want to mention, in 1896, the United States Supreme Court ruled on Plessy versus Ferguson, and that's, you may have heard of that one. It's the one where they decided that separate but equal is equal, and that will come into play later in the events that happen. So before we talk about what happened in Wilmington in 1898, I just want to go about 20 miles south to Southport and see what was happening in Southport after the war. So Southport is obviously much smaller than Wilmington. There were about 1,200 people at the time, and about a third of them in the 1890s were African American. So I just did a quick list of some people who were formerly enslaved, who were, and what they were doing in Southport at that time. So there was Melissa Jackson. She and her husband, Jack Jackson over there, they were farmers and they owned over 900 acres of land. She was a midwife, a businesswoman, and a philanthropist. Frank Gordon, up in the corner there, he was an educator. He was a child when the war ended, and he managed to get himself an education, and then he turned around and educated many, many African American children and adults. And if you get the Whittler's Bench, our newsletter, in the latest issue, there's an article about Frank Gordon that was written by his great-granddaughter, who still lives in Southport. Abram Galloway, up in the corner, he was a veteran of the Union Army. He served in the United States Colored Troops. And in 1897, he was the chairman of the Southport Republican Party. James Griffin was a property owner. He owned 2 of the original 100 lots in Southport on Red Street. His son, Whitfield Griffin, was also a property owner. He and his wife and another gentleman owned the land that he sold to the African American community that became the John N. Smith Cemetery. Wesley Lee was a school committee member, as was Whitfield Griffin. And when I say school committee member, I don't mean an African American school committee member. I mean Southport had a school committee. There were 5 members of it, and he and Whitfield and Wesley were 2 of the members, so there were 2 African American members. Freeman Hankins built several houses on Rhett Street, and Frank Davis was the first and only African American postmaster of Southport. So for a small community, people were doing pretty well. And from a political standpoint, Southport mirrored a lot of what was going on in Wilmington. Southport was largely Democrat. There were about 50 more Democrat voters than Republicans in Southport, so they won most of the elections. Occasionally, a Republican or a populist would get elected into something. In the election of 1887, the whites had 2 slates of candidates running, and then there were some African Americans running. Well, the whites split their vote between the candidates. The African Americans came in and actually ended up getting 3 people elected, which left the white people a little confused and discombobulated. But that was the only time that happened, but that did happen. All right, so the issues with the concerns were statewide. It was not just limited to Wilmington or Southport. The Democrats were very, very concerned about what was happening in the state. So the head of the Democrat committee, Furnifold Simmons, for North Carolina, said, I know how to fix this. I've got a plan. We're not going to win on issues, But what we can do is we need to draw those populists, those white people, back into the Democratic Party. And in order to do that, we're going to run a campaign on white supremacy. We're going to remind them of the importance of race. And he said, I can do this, but I need men who can speak, men who can write, and men who can ride. So by men who could speak, he meant public speakers. Remember, before the internet and TV and radio, so people would go around and deliver speeches. And sometimes the speeches were written up in newspapers. Alfred Waddell was one of the speakers, and he would give very fiery speakers. And there was one speech he gave in October in Wilmington that has pretty much haunted Wilmington ever since. And he said that he would end Negro domination if he needed to choke the current of the Cape Fear with carcasses. So very fiery rhetoric. Men who could write. So Josephus Daniels bought the newspaper in Raleigh. He was a Democrat who worked with Furnifold Simmons, and he said, I'll make this newspaper the mouthpiece of the Democratic Party and of the white supremacy movement. So he set about to publish anti-black propaganda in his newspaper, as did the Charlotte Observer to a lesser extent and other newspapers around there. So there was a lot of newspaper articles talking badly about African Americans. And then he said, I need men who can ride. And by that he meant vigilantes. And so they formed a paramilitary group called the Red Shirts. And these were men that would ride around or march around if they didn't have horses, with guns, with rifles, and they would break up Republicans' conventions, trying to meet, trying to register to vote, and of course trying to vote. So anytime there was some kind of congregation where people were getting together to try to, from a Republican or fusionist standpoint. So remember that a large part of the population was not literate. So Josephus Daniels, he went by Jody Daniels, also made very good use of political cartoons. And they were very powerful cartoons. He had very skilled cartoonists that worked for him. And these were very powerful. Whether you could read or not, these stuck with you. These were a good imagery, and I'll give you some examples. This one was in August of the year of the election, and you can see we have a white man being smashed under the boot of the Negro, and it says, a serious question, how long will this last? 2 weeks later, he printed this one, where we see this arm coming out labeled honest white man. Looks like he has a club, but it's actually a ballot rolled up to look like a club, and he's bludgeoning this caricature of an African-American man. In his feather, it says Negro rule, and the caption says, a warning, get back, we will not stand it. And then 2 weeks before the election, we see this cartoon. This dapper Southern gentleman is getting ready to cast his vote, and right behind him is the devil. And the devil is wearing a label that says fusionist. And he's whispering in his ear, and he's reaching his arm around to push his ballot into the ballot box, and his ballot says Negro rule. And the caption says, don't be tempted by the devil. And here's a picture of some of the red shirts, the vigilantes that would roam the state and intimidate people. So we talked a lot about this newspaper. They wanted to trash this newspaper, and that was a big point with the campaign. So that started with a woman named Rebecca Felton, who was the wife of a politician in Georgia.
No kid to the Rebecca Felton here.
Oh, is there Rebecca Felton
Yeah,
here?
yeah.
Oh my goodness, no!
It is, I mean, I've talked with, but no kid, because
No
this
kid.
one was Georgia, though, so I'm sorry to interrupt.
No relation. So Rebecca Felton, Mrs. Felton, was a speaker, and she was asked to talk to the Farm Bureau about what were some of the concerns of farm wives in the South. And she said, well, one of the biggest concerns is being raped. So there's all these articles about being raped, rape and by African Americans in the newspapers. So she said that that's a big concern. And she said if it needs lynching to protect women's dearest possession from the ravening human beasts, then I say lynch 1,000 times a week. So she gave that speech in 1897, but it got picked up by the newspapers as the campaign was going on. So they printed that because they thought that was good, furthered their cause. So Alexander Manley was the editor of the Daily Record, the black newspaper. He was actually the grandson of a former North Carolina governor. His grandmother had been a slave of that governor, and so he was descended from her. And he started the newspaper, and he he published an editorial in response to her speech. It was a very long editorial. I pulled out a couple. I tried to make it as short as possible, but this was as much as I could condense it. So first he talked about the anti-black propaganda that had been going on in the state. And he said, the papers are filled often with reports of rapes of white women and the subsequent lynching of the alleged rapist. The editors pour forth volumes of aspersions against all Negroes because of the few who may be guilty. If the papers and speakers of the other race would condemn the commission of crime because it is crime and not try to make it appear that the Negroes were the only criminals, they would find their strongest allies in the intelligent Negroes themselves, and together the whites and blacks would root the evil out of both races. And then he ended it with, tell your men that it is no worse for a black man to be intimate with a white woman than for a white man to be intimate with a colored woman. You set yourselves down as a lot of carping hypocrites in that you cry aloud for the virtue of your women while you seek to destroy the morality of ours. Don't think ever that your women will remain pure while you are debauching ours. You sow the seed, the harvest will come in due time. So, what's interesting is, I think, Rebecca Latimer Felton called for lynching, 1,000 a week, and people went, yeah, okay, sounds good. Alexander Manley said, you know, people are sleeping with each other on both sides, and, you know, let's look at this from both sides. And people said, lynch him, lynch him. And there was a big hue and cry to do that. Now, Furnifold Simmons, remember, in charge of the white supremacy campaign, said, no, this is gold. He said, I couldn't have asked for something better. Be sure you do not do anything to him until after the election. So instead, what the newspapers did is publish almost every single day articles about that horrible, vile article that Manley wrote. He shouldn't be allowed to continue to publish. He shouldn't be allowed to continue to live. It's a horrible, vile thing. We never should have put it in the paper. He never should have printed it. If you'd like to read it, it's on page 3. So they would, and they wouldn't print the whole thing, of course. They would print bits and pieces that made it look as bad as possible. So it just fell right into what they were planning and really gave a rallying point. Because now, if anybody had any qualms about being against Negro rule, they could turn it around in their minds and say, no, I'm fighting for white womanhood. And they could feel virtuous about what they were doing. So, as Harry said, the white citizens of Wilmington and North Carolina became enraged over this unwarranted attack by this smart aleck Manley upon the virtue and character of Southern womanhood, which indeed was in flower in the entire Southland. So, the day before the election came, Alfred Waddell gave a speech at Thalian Hall. He said, you are Anglo-Saxons. You are armed and prepared, and you will do your duty. Go to the polls tomorrow. If you find a Negro out voting, tell him to leave the polls, and if he refuses, kill him. Shoot him down in his tracks. We shall win tomorrow if we have to do it with guns. The day of the morning of the election, there was an article on the front page of the paper that said, what will you be? Today, white men of North Carolina must declare where they stand. It's a question of race, not politics. And this is an excerpt from the article, and the capitalization is the way it was printed. I didn't do that. It says it is no longer a question of party, but of race. A fearful responsibility rests upon each voter, and the white men will mark and hold responsible each man who deserts his race. So they were no longer just content with intimidating the African Americans from voting. They were also intimidating white men and saying, you better vote with your party because we're watching you, and there will be repercussions. So, who do you think won? This is the newspaper from after the election. White supremacy triumphs in the Old North State. Fusionists utterly routed, Negro rule damned. Now Harry said, of course, there were some irregularities in this statewide election, in this city and elsewhere in the state, but the white citizens realized that victory had to be won by hook or by crook. Otherwise, they would have to continue to live under the intolerable conditions of the time. So here's some statistics from the Wilmington election, And I'll just briefly point out, in the 5th precinct of the 1st ward, there were 30 white registered voters. 456 of them voted for Democrats. In the 4th precinct, there were 337 black voters, 94 voted. In the 2nd precinct of the 5th ward, there were 154 registered voters and 39 voted. So we can see ballot stuffing and intimidation was pretty much how they managed the election. Now in Southport, and obviously Harry got this story from his brother-in-law, Jesse Price, and he said populist ballots, which had been printed on yellow paper, were ordered thrown out by Captain Jesse Price and other election officials at Southport, as the law specifically required that the ballots should be printed on white paper. So I don't know if there was intimidation or if there was ballot stuffing, but they were able to just discard the ballots. They didn't need to worry about it. So, but the election was over. And the African-American people of Wilmington breathed a sigh of relief because there had been a lot of tension building up to that election, a lot of concern about safety. And they were like, okay, we lost the election, but we live to, vote again. And there'll be another election in a few years. But the day after the election, there was a notice in the newspaper that said, "Attention white men, there will be a meeting of the white men of Wilmington this morning at 11 o'clock at the courthouse. A full attendance is desired as business in the furtherance of white supremacy will be transacted." And remember, the election of 1898, while it was a statewide election, Wilmington didn't have an election. It's for the mayor. The mayor and the aldermen were not up for election that year, so they were still in charge. So they still had some business to do. So at the meeting that they had, they read the white man's Declaration of Independence, and it started with, "We, the undersigned citizens of the city of Wilmington and county of New Hanover, do hereby declare that we will no longer be ruled and will never again be ruled by men of African origin." So Alfred Waddell read that declaration. William French, who was Harry's brother-in-law, he said that there were a lot of the longer speeches by Waddell and a couple other gentlemen, Hugh McCrae and some of the men that were there, and then there were some shorter speeches that were maybe 10 or 15 minutes, and he says he gave one of those. Now, I haven't been able to corroborate that, so I don't know whether he did give a speech or whether he was just sort of exaggerating his role to impress his brother-in-law. But we do know that he was there because he did sign the Declaration of Independence, as did almost all the businessmen in Wilmington that day. The next morning, the Morning Star printed the minutes of that meeting, along with a copy of the white man's Declaration of Independence, which included their intention to remove Alexander Manly from Wilmington and to destroy the printing press. They also mentioned they'd like to remove the mayor, the sheriff, and the aldermen, but they tabled that suggestion as being maybe a little too radical. And then they called a meeting of prominent African Americans because they were going to have them remove Manly and shut down his newspaper. So they called these men together, they read them the White Men's Declaration of Independence, they told them what they wanted them to do, and they said, well, we'll use our influence to try to do that. And they said, we want it in writing by tomorrow morning, 7 a.m., deliver it to Waddell. So they wrote a letter, but the attorney that they asked to deliver it, for some reason did not deliver it to Waddell. They don't know whether it's because he knew he was on a list of people they wanted to move out of the city, and he was intimidated, he was afraid of Waddell, he didn't want to understand the directions. Whatever the reason was, he put it in the mailbox instead of delivering it to Waddell. So the morning came, no letter. Waddell went over to Thalian Hall where people were congregating, waiting for the response. There were hundreds of men gathered. They waited. Finally at 8:30, Waddell said, well, we haven't gotten a response. We're going to take it into our own hands. Let's go over, let's march over. So they started to march from Thalian Hall across Wilmington to Brooklyn where the printing press was. And as they marched, more men joined and more men joined, so that there's estimates that maybe it was up to about 1,000 men had descended upon this. When they arrived there, they destroyed the printing press, fire broke out, the building burned to the ground. This is a picture of the men that they took afterwards to show that they've been there. The people up on the top, it's hard to see, but the people up on the top are actually, they're African American and they're wearing helmets. Those are actually firemen. So after the fire had burned for a while, it started to threaten other buildings, and so they did call the fire department and ask them to put it out. And Waddell was very complimentary of their work. He said they did a great job. When they were done burning that down and getting their photos taken for posterity, Waddell said, "All right, men, we're done here. We've done what we've come to do. Now disperse, go home." And he said, don't cause any more trouble unless trouble finds you. And then he left for business at the city hall. So the men started marching home. Now, at the same time, there were a lot of African American men at work across town. And they began to hear rumors that there was a fire in their neighborhood, and that there were people marching with guns, and they were worried about their wives and their children. So they left work and they started heading home. And these men were heading in that direction, and eventually they all met. And as Harry said, all hell broke loose. It's impossible to know how many people were killed that day. There were, we do know there were 3 white men that were injured. Waddell says 10 or 11 African American men were killed. Harry documented 25. There are other accounts that it may have been 60 or more African American men killed. The reason that we can't find out is there's several reasons. One is that the next day, when they were permitted to go and retrieve the bodies from the streets, some people just took them and buried them in their backyards. They were family members. They didn't want any more trouble. They didn't want anyone coming after them. That may have been the person they relied on to protect them. It may have been their husband, their father. That was their protection, and now he was gone. They just buried him. There may have been bodies thrown into the river, as Waddell had said. They would have disappeared. In addition, as the violence was taking place, many people ran away. They ran into the cemetery, they ran into the swamps, they hid. It was November, it was cold, they had no shelter, they had no food, they were women and children, they were terrified, and they hid. Some of them just left. They found their way to other parts of North Carolina or Virginia. They just left and didn't go back. Some of them did go back, but over the next couple of weeks, about between 2,000 and 3,000 people left Wilmington. They were no longer felt safe there, and they left. So there was no way to say, okay, well, who's missing, and we can figure out then who was killed, because people were missing for various reasons. Waddell had gone back to Thalian Hall. City Hall's on the second floor, and he and his colleagues met with the mayor and the aldermen, the sheriff, and deputies, and one by one they forced them to resign. And then new people were put into place, and that's when he became mayor. They then rounded them up, took them down to the train, put them on the train, and said, don't ever come back to Wilmington. They had a list of between 20 and 25 members of the community in Wilmington that they wanted out of the city, that they felt would be a threat. Most of them were African American. There were also some white men that they thought might be resistant to the change. So they went around and rounded all of them up, put them in the jail overnight for safekeeping, and the next day they marched them out of town and put them on trains and said, don't ever come back. Harry Hayden said, the men who took down their shotguns and cleared the Negroes out of office yesterday were not a mob of plug uglies. They were men of property, intelligence, culture, clergymen, lawyers, bankers, merchants. They are not a mob. They are revolutionists asserting a sacred privilege and a right. And the newspapers agreed with Harry. The next day there was in Wilmington bloody conflict with Negroes. White men forced to take up arms for the preservation of law and order. Blacks provoked trouble. The Negro newspaper plant destroyed. The whites fired upon by Negroes. The firing returned. In the Raleigh News and Observer, they said, a day of blood at Wilmington. Negroes precipitate conflict by firing on the whites. Manly, the defamer of white womanhood, escapes. Building of his slanderous paper gutted and burned. 11 Negroes were killed, 3 whites wounded. Board of Aldermen changed legally. Mayor and chief of police resign, and city under control of new and conservative Democratic government. Mayor Waddell posts guards around jail to protect Negro prisoners. And about 2 weeks later, Waddell published an article about the events in a national magazine, Collier's Weekly. And this is an illustration that accompanied the article, so you can kind of get a feel for what the tone of that story was about. So the long-term changes to Wilmington, up until this event happened, you can see the African-American population was growing and had exceeded the white population. After this happened, within a couple years, the population had dropped by a couple thousand. It continued to grow over time, but at a much slower pace, and never again was were they in the majority. In North Carolina as a state, in 1896, for both the governor and the president, you can see that about 60% of the votes were Republican. 4 years later, in 1900, almost 100% of the votes were Democrat. So in effect, North Carolina became a one-party state. Now, Harry mentioned that not only was this a story of the Wilmington Revolution of 1898, but also the elimination of the Negro as a political factor in Wilmington. And the way that happened is, once the Democrats were in power, they went about changing the laws. So they put together the grandfather clause. Now, North Carolina is not the first state to do that. Other states had tried that, but some of their laws had gotten found unconstitutional. So they kind of looked at how could we do it better. So they came up with a two-part plan. There was a literacy test, which implied that you could then work your way into voting because you could pass the literacy test. And then they had an exclusion for anybody whose grandfather had voted before 1867. So that meant that white people were excluded from that, whether they were literate or not. African Americans would have to take the literacy test because there wasn't anybody who was voting before 1867. And they made the literacy test harder and harder so no one could pass it. In addition, there was still a lot of intimidation, so very few people even tried to take the literacy test. So in effect, African Americans lost the vote by 1900. Now, remember I said Plessy versus Ferguson had been passed 2 years earlier. That was the separate but equal is equal. So that led the government in North Carolina to start passing laws for separate but equal, so segregation. They passed laws, you may have heard them called Jim Crow laws. And it was a combination of laws, codes, and customs. And the reason for that, the Democrats' main reason for eliminating the vote and for doing this, because they never wanted to be overthrown again. They never wanted to lose power again. And so if you remember, the Fusionists was a cooperation between whites and blacks. They didn't want that to happen again, and so one way to avoid that from happening again is to ensure that people do not socialize with each other, so they made it so they didn't work together, they didn't play together, they didn't socialize together, they didn't shop together, they didn't do anything together, and it was a contentious relationship. And so through those Jim Crow laws and codes and everything, they pretty much made them live and work in separate spheres. So in Southport, what that meant is that the voting became all Democrat. Only whites were in position of authority from that point on. Churches, cemeteries, schools, healthcare was segregated. Restaurants and businesses were segregated. An example is the Amuse You Theater that some people may be familiar with. African Americans were allowed to go there, but they had to sit up on the balcony. They couldn't sit down in the seats with the white people, and they couldn't use the bathroom when they were there. Couldn't use water fountains, and couldn't use restrooms, couldn't intermingle. And there were professions that were not open to African Americans. So for example, it was fine if they wanted to work on the fishing boats, but they couldn't be captain of the fishing boats. So opportunities were much, much more limited. So I said that the official version was the official version for about 100 years. And in 2000, the state of North Carolina said, we need to investigate what happened in Wilmington in 1898. So they put together a commission, and they worked for about 6 years investigating it. And they produced a report. And the report said, Wilmington's 1898 racial violence was not accidental. It began a successful statewide Democratic campaign to regain control of state government, disenfranchise African Americans, and create a system of legal segregation which persisted into the second half of the 20th century. And that's really important, because you could look at this and think, 1898, it was so long ago, why do we care? But the ramifications continued on well into our lifetimes. So it wasn't until the 60s that the civil rights movement started. So for a good 60 years, this just continued on. And then the civil rights movement didn't work magically overnight. So you have another 30, 40 years, even today, we have a lot of problems with discrimination. So this event that happened has a long-term effect up until now. So I just want to be sure that I don't give you the impression that this was an isolated event, that North Carolina and Wilmington was the only place this was happening, because it's just not true. There have been riots in this country that were with white people attacking black people because they became too prosperous, or they started to feel threatened by them since the 1830s. You had riots in Ohio, you had riots in Illinois, in New York City. Tulsa was a huge one. 200 people were killed in Tulsa. 6,000 houses were destroyed. Florida, Louisiana, and they were just horrible, horrible riots. And just like in North Carolina, they weren't taught about it in schools. We just sort of buried that past. So the difference with this riot versus some of those other riots is that it wasn't spontaneous. It was definitely planned, and it was planned by the leaders of the city. It was planned by the people who had money and power, and they very much manipulated people and planned this riot. And because they were able to do it, because they were able to kill innocent African Americans in the street, they were worried. They were very worried what the repercussions would be from the North. This was not that long after Reconstruction. They were concerned that they would be retaliated against. And yet they weren't. Nothing happened. And that's another key point. It wasn't just the people of Wilmington who let down the African Americans. It was the governor of the state who didn't do enough he sent in troops, but in some instances the troops worked against the African Americans. He didn't ask the president for help. The president and the governor had been elected by the African Americans. He was Republican. He won by a margin that was less than the population of the African Americans. So they put him in office, yet he didn't do anything to help. The president of the United States, William McKinley, was a Republican. African Americans had helped to vote him into office. He didn't do anything. Even though he said, well, the government didn't ask me for help, but he had letters, telegrams, he had people come and visit him to beg him to do something, and he didn't do anything. The Senate, the Congress, the general population of the country, the U.S. Supreme Court, everyone was complicit in this. Everyone let them down. So there is no, it's just Wilmington. It was everyone. So you may be wondering, well, what did happen to the people that did all of this? What were the consequences? Well, they were actually only positive consequences. Furnifold Simmons, who had orchestrated the whole thing, ended up running for senator in North Carolina, and he ran as the chieftain of white supremacy. He was proud of what he had done. He was elected. He continued to serve for 30 years. He was the longest serving senator in North Carolina, and he continued to do it on white supremacy. Alfred Waddell, I already told you, he became mayor. He stayed mayor for most of the rest of his life. He lived about another 10 or 12 years, and he was the mayor most of that time. Josephus Daniels, who ran the newspaper, he ended up becoming the Secretary of the Navy for Wilson, and he became the ambassador to Mexico for FDR. So as opposed to it being a bad thing, it almost became a feather in their cap if they could say they had participated in what had gone on in Wilmington. So, I wanted to loop back when we talked about in the beginning, how do we do our job as historians? So today we looked at some truths. There's some pretty unpleasant truths, and there were some conflicting stories. So as historians, how do we determine what's the truth? When we get conflicting stories in history, we read conflicting documents, maybe we hear conflicting stories lore around the town, or if we're genealogists, family lore, or even reading the current events in today's newspapers and on the internet. How do we figure out what's the truth? So critical thinking skills is what we need, and I'm hoping that I model some today. One, use multiple sources. Don't rely on one source for your history, for your news, for anything. Don't let someone else tell you what to think. Look at original and contemporary sources if possible. But even when you're looking at contemporary sources, remember, those people had an agenda too. So you want to look at who are these people? How do they know what they know? And what's their agenda in telling you that? And then look at the broader context. If you're looking at historical events, what happened before? What happened after? Where does the event you're looking at fit into history? And just like a detective trying to solve a crime follows the money, follows the power, do the same thing. Who stood to benefit? Who was really trying to orchestrate this? And then the last one, which is the hardest one to do, is to avoid confirmation bias. And confirmation bias is, we all have a worldview. We all have a way that we think the world works. And when we look at facts, two different people can look at the same set of facts, and if they have a different worldview, they'll both look at it and go, yeah, see, that's the way it happened. It confirms what I think. And it's so hard to avoid that because it feels so good. You just want to be proven right. And so when you're trying to get to the truth of things, it's best to, as much as possible, to be objective as possible. And it's hard to do that, and the only way that I know to do it is to kind of use sort of like a debating trick where you try to look for the other side, and is to try to get into the mindset of people that have a different worldview than you do, and to try to understand it. So, going through this, I tried to understand it from, the African Americans' viewpoint, from the white supremacist viewpoint, from the people that were caught in the middle. And it's imperfect. You can only imagine what it's like to be somebody else, as much as you can. But at least it kind of helps you try to figure out what the facts are. So, while I was putting this together, this quote came up in the news, and I thought it was really timely. Someone had, another politician had tried to misrepresent some of his lynching history in this country, and somebody else, this Colorado State Representative Leslie Herod, kind of slapped her down and said, no, that's not the way it worked. And she said, if we're not honest about our history, if we don't face our past, then we'll never be able to move forward as a nation and a country. So, in the beginning, I told you it was going to be sort of an uncomfortable conversation, but that I hoped that at the end you would think it was a worthwhile conversation and that you had gained from discussing it. And I want to commend you all for staying here, for listening to it, for helping us face our past, and hopefully then we'll be helping us move forward as a community. If I've really whetted your appetite and you want more information about the Wilmington Race Riot, because believe me, I've condensed it down and it is fascinating, I really recommend these sources. The Wilmington Race Riot Report is what was put out by the commission, the North Carolina Commission. It's 400 or 500 pages, but it's really readable. It reads like a book, and it tells everything that happened before, during, and after, and that's available online. A Day of Blood is a book written about the Wilmington Race Riot, and the author, LaRae Umfleet, was one of the main authors of the Race Riot Report. It was put together by a committee of about 13 people, but when it actually came to writing it, he did a lot of the writing. He's a very good writer, so he wrote both of those. Cape Fear Rising, which some people have mentioned to me that they had read before this, is historical fiction. Sometimes it's easier to understand history by reading a historical fiction and then looking for the facts. Democracy Betrayed is a collection of essays and articles by historians who have written about this over the last 100 years. They put it together in a compilation. The Marrow of Tradition is a fascinating book. It's a novel. It was written in 1901 by Charles Chestnut, who was an African-American novelist. So he wrote it shortly after it happened. It's really a novel about people, and the riot is happening in the background, but it's also very interesting because obviously they knew what the real story was, because a lot of what he wrote about is what Harry wrote about later. So common knowledge was how the riot had actually taken place. But it's very interesting. He's African American, but he wrote his characters. Some of them are former slaves, some of them were people who were born after the Civil War, and some of them were white people. He gave different viewpoints, so it's very interesting.
And he could vote because his grandfather had in Raleigh.
Yes, yeah, he was,
When the,
oh, that's interesting.
Yeah.
That's interesting, so he did, but I don't know if he did vote,
oh,
though.
yeah,
Did
yeah,
he?
yeah, he was very prominent. In fact, his house was about 3 doors down from Josephus Daniels.
Really? That's very interesting. So he's an interesting guy. And then the story of the Wilmington Rebellion, written by Harry Hayden, that is available online. Just, the text is out there. You'll probably find it on a white supremacy website. That's where I found it. The one thing I find interesting, I'd like to finish with Harry Hayden's, is that in the Wilmington Race Riot Report that was what North Carolina published, they do mention that they're indebted to Harry and his book because he wrote this book and another book, the History of the Wilmington Light Infantry, when he interviewed a lot of people. And because Harry agreed with them, he was one of them, he was able to interview people and get the inside story and document a lot of stuff that they might not have told somebody else. So the report, the committee was able to use his works to really document and do a lot of their research and understand what really happened. So I don't think that's what Harry had in mind when he wrote it, but it was kind of nice that it was able to go for that use. And that's the end of my presentation. We're out of time, so I understand if you have to leave, but if anybody has any questions or comments, I'd be happy to stay and talk to you.
No, I want to commend you. I've never heard anybody do it better on both sides, really. Because I'll tell you one thing I found out about white supremacists. None of them owned slaves. Their parents of Josephus Daniels, Acock, Simmons, none of them were slave owners. And that's where the competition started, the free blacks and the poor whites. And the cartoon that showed with the foot on it, we had what was called the Southern Initiative under Nixon, and we had a TV ad that had a white man looking at all these bills and crumbling up paper, what am I gonna do, how am I gonna live, because black children were being paid different things and going to school. But that's when the South became Republican.
Mm-hmm.
And that type thing, that scare tactic, what's gonna happen. But it's interesting to me, the names have changed, but not the motive for why, how and whoever's doing what.
Exactly.
But I thought it was excellent. And the red shirts really came over the border from South Carolina, because in my part of the state, northeastern North Carolina, we had 3 black Republican congressmen. But we didn't have KKK up there or red shirts, but the red shirts were from South Carolina.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a lot of violence in South Carolina. They were very much saying, we'll take care of Manly. Send them
They
here. We'll
came
take
out and
them.
brought up in daylight with their faces showing that the Ku Klux Klan came at night, covered up. They were cowards.
Mm-hmm.
But the Ku Klux Klan in North Carolina lynched more white people than black. Well, see, they were voting Republican. Because they wanted prominence, and after a while the Republicans let go of the blacks totally, talk about not protecting them, because see, they were being made, the things that could be federal appointments like you were talking about, like the port and post office in particular. And that's who had given the Republicans all of our power, but they weren't giving them anything.
Right.
So they had a break, but you really did a great job.
Very well.
Indeed.
Just a comment that not necessarily the specifics, but the general scenario that you've laid out of the approach is very important for us to consider now as we look at the threats to liberal democracy throughout the world. And so we need to back away from this story a little bit and look at the framework of it and see things that are happening in our world today.
Indeed, yes.
There's a lot to be learned from what happened.
Yeah.
It is.
Thank you very much.
Everything had a basis. And the people in power, they were the ones that had lost power. They'd had the prominence, they'd been the slave owners, all of these people, but what they also had was a machine gun.
They did, they had a Gatling gun and a.
Yeah, that
and a
Gatling
rapid fire.
gun, that was a man of Dennis in Murfreesboro invented that thing, but that was a threat that they could just put on the back part of a wagon,
Yeah,
be in
they
front
would
of.
drive it around.
But it also
point
came
it at
out
people.
that Manley did not personally write that editorial.
Yeah, that's why I said he just published it.
His associate did, and his great nephew came here about 3 or 4 years ago.
Really?
It was really attractive, he was light skinned too, and he was telling things that have come out, it's taken 100 years, but they did come out, and that was one of them that he had not written it or approved of it.
Yeah,
He was out of town,
yeah.
but that's,
But he was blamed for it.
oh yeah, well, you know, the buck stopped there, he was the
He was the editor, he was the
Yeah.
editor.
Now, maybe I missed it, you told us, but what actually happened to him physically? Did
To
he-
Manley, he
Uh-huh.
actually did escape,
He did.
so, from town, and then he went to Washington and stayed with a congressman there. There was an African-American congressman from North Carolina. I think he stayed there, and then he ended up moving, and he got married and had started a family. He never worked in the newspaper business again, but he did start some leagues that helped African Americans get jobs and things like that.
And see, the fusionists, Russell had as many slaves as anybody, so marketed him all the way to Wilmington, right before you get to Waterford and all of that, but I mean, he was a big slave owner, and he did betray them.
He did.
I mean, he said, I'll help you, I'm gonna do it, but he just got elected, he didn't.
He didn't, and then he turned around and blamed them and said,
Right.
at a later point, he said, you know, it's been 30 years since slavery, and they only own 3% of the property. And he said, you could say, yeah, that's 3% up from nothing, but on the other hand, he said, they had a lot of, this is interesting, he said, they had a lot of advantages that white people didn't have, because they were used to hard work. They were used to, you know, doing all that. They were used to suffering and waiting. And we weren't used to that. So he said, they had that advantage. And he said, now they probably squandered it because it's gone on. So, yeah, he had some interesting rationalizations and distorted thinking. Yeah, but he didn't. And when the red shirts actually attacked him too. When he was coming back from voting, he took the train to vote in Wilmington, and then when he was taking the train home, they stopped at the station, and the red shirts congregated on the
He
train.
had a high.
He hit him in the
had
mail
a
car.
rail car, yeah.
Yeah, so.
I'm curious, have you talked with any of the committees that, the Monument of Paddles, do you know about that in Wilmington?
I do.
Okay.
They did put a monument now in Wilmington for the events of 1898.
And then they got
What's
they
Bertha's
put
last
up a
name?
historical society that makes it more like what you said at the end, that it tones it down, but it's like they had a right to do what they did, you know?
Well, the African Americans have really worked at creating a relationship with the whites in Wilmington over this monumental
That's good.
paddles, the monuments of paddles. And I think that there's a different version now of what's going on in Wilmington. What is Bertha's last name?
Bertha Bryant Bell?
Yes, I've heard her talk, and she's, do you know her?
Don't.
Oh, well,
Her son was a planning board director
right.
for a
So
while,
there's
but,
And Lorraine was with her.
Okay.
Lorraine is a writer, and so they work together on this, so you might want to talk with her.
well, I've got
She's
the
very
whole
interesting.
book thing. They were trying to do the black and white thing that I went to 3 years ago that has all of their research of that committee. But they have been trying, and it keeps coming up. I mean, people now realize the contribution, not just of working in the fields, but the contributions blacks made.
Of the African
Yeah,
American.
to
I think that was their purpose.
Yeah.
So,
That's good.
she's
because
very
there's been,
interesting.
Yeah, ongoing racial tensions in Wilmington too.
Well,
Since
yeah,
the
they had the
70s.
Wilmington 10 in like the 1980s.
Yeah, yeah,
And said that a man had done something he had not done.
right.
And Ben Chavis was a,
Do you know where that monument of paddles is? It's,
I've seen pictures of it, but I don't know
you pass
exactly where
it
it
and you
is.
don't even realize.
Well,
Yeah, it didn't look like it was a very prominent spot.
Well, it's like you're coming off of the new bridge
Right.
and you're going into town,
Uh-huh.
And if you look closely, it's on the left-hand side, it's just very, left-hand side, and it's just a couple blocks, because you're
Off the
focused,
bridge,
going down Third Street, and
Yeah.
it's on that,
Okay, so you have
left
to really.
side. Yeah, you have to watch for it.
Okay.
But there's parking, you can park.
Okay, yeah, I've seen photos.
You can see it, cause you remember
about a
when they
couple
were
blocks.
building the bridge, the second thing, you had to stop right there for
Yeah.
a while, and that's where
Are
it
you
is.
saying paddle, like a paddle?
Monument paddle.
It's like
Okay.
paddles, looks like
Is
giant
that-
paddles stuck in the ground. So there's like a half a dozen or something paddles, it's.
And what is the correlation?
Because they paddle their ways, the slaves paddled through the water to get to the Americas.
Well,
And it's water connected.
yeah, their connection
With
to
the water
water.
and the boats.
Yeah, the connection to water as a sort of spiritual thing.
Is it specifically commemorating this event?
Yes.
Yeah,
Okay.
it's supposed to
And
commemorate.
they're paddles, they're huge paddles.
Yeah.
They're probably 10.
It's symbolism, because they also escaped through the swamps and paddled in poles.
Right.
They poled
It's all
themselves
water
out.
connected, and
Yeah.
that's what they needed to get their freedom.
But you know what's interesting to me is you had men down here, black, who would take the master's wares all the way up to Edenton alone. And he would decide how much he was gonna pay people to take it off, he would get the money and come back. Just not even keep on going, but would come back. I mean, it's a lot of just things that you think, what?
Well, but it also was harder and harder to escape after the fugitive slave law, so they could have gone north, but then they would just get
After the
brought back
Dred
north.
Scott, yeah, I think that was horrible. It was, but a lot of people did buy their freedom